Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 35. I am the show's host, Kyle. Today's show is going to cover current events in the news, mainly focused on Middle East stuff today. I am going to get to a North Korea show on Friday. I think on Friday's show, I'm just going to start out giving current events on the topic and then just kind of detailing who the two major players are, what everybody's interest in the region is, why everybody's on the side they're on, the best that we could tell, and just kind of, try to make it so that if anybody spends 10 to 15 minutes listening to the first chunk of Friday's show, they will at least be able to talk about North Korea and know, the dynamics between North Korea and South Korea and what's going on there. And with that, we'll get into today's news. The first thing I want to talk about is that we had a statement from somebody at the Pentagon saying that the U.S. is bombing faster than the bombs could be replaced. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that this statement probably, while it is true now, probably isn't a statement that's true all the time. I'm sure that if, U.S. bomb-making capabilities were at a slightly higher level, like if we put more money into manufacturing because the government was buying more, then you're going to see more bombs produced. And so I'm guessing that's probably what's happening is that, just the U.S. capabilities of how many bombs we could build aren't very high right now, and if they were higher, then this wouldn't be the case because, we're bombing Middle Eastern countries, but we're not dropping bombs like we would, in a World War II situation. So if anybody's making the point and, trying to be like, oh, hell yeah, this is a point for Trump, Trump's dropping so many bombs they can't make enough. Well, first of all, that seems stupid. If you're defending a country and you have a limited amount of resources and those resources are important to defending the country, you would think that would be a hell of a lot smarter to save those bombs and then use them whenever somebody's attacking your homeland rather than going and bombing some terrorist group out in the caves of Afghanistan who have little to no chance of ever attacking the United States. It seems absurd that if you were somebody who was just kind of concerned as the average Republican is about the defense of the homeland, this seems to be a negative, and you would be like, what the hell, Trump, save some of our bombs for the people attacking us. Don't use them all on a bunch of people running around the desert. So that's certainly one problem with this. And like I said, the other problem is it's not even true, but I think it does go to show just how much Trump is bombing that. However much Obama was bombing, Trump is obviously doing it more because now production isn't matching the supply needed. And so that obviously production has to go up to match the supply needed. I think it's such a stupid thing to waste all the money on these bombs. These bombs are very expensive. We're talking millions of dollars each. These aren't, $100 here, $100 here. It's not, like shooting off bottle rockets in your backyard or anything like that where you're getting them almost for free. And of course, the U.S. government is the U.S. government and can't bargain at all and has no ability to negotiate it, mainly because all the people who are doing the negotiating are in the pockets of the companies they're negotiating with, so they have no incentive to negotiate for a lower price. So the bombs are as expensive as possible. We're paying, out the nose for the bombs, and it should be a black mark on the Trump administration's record that they can't negotiate with countries, that they have to use up all of our bombs, not a bragging point they're using to say, hey, look how great we are, we're bombing everybody all over the world. So for anybody who's an alarmist and is freaking out saying, oh my God, the U.S. needs to make more bombs, calm down, we're fine, we're bombing people we don't need to be bombing right now, we have so many bombs. The Moab was a bomb that apparently was about to expire, the shelf life on the Moab's only 4 years or so, and so when that shelf life was near approaching, that's when they decided to drop the bomb, I guess, in Afghanistan. So maybe some of these bombs are being exploded just for the sake of exploding them and not letting them go to waste, which is a shame that you're wasting human life to save the usefulness of a bomb. But the immorality of war is always amazing what people are willing to tolerate during these times. Moving on to a different story, Russia says that the U.S. will be violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty if the U.S. goes ahead and puts anti-missile defense systems in Poland and Romania. I guess first we could talk about why this treaty was put in place and why the Russians and the United States, who originally, I believe the USSR originally signed the treaty, thought it was important, and that was that neither country would have first strike capabilities, that this treaty was in place. The fear was that Russia or the U.S. would build so many anti-missile defense systems surrounding each other that each other would feel confident bombing the other one because of they had enough missiles to defend the homeland, and this would lead to nuclear war, and that the mutually assured destruction idea. So what part of this treaty does is it limits the number of anti-missile defense systems that the U.S. or USSR, now Russia, could have. The U.S. is looking at putting these missile defense systems in Poland and Russia. This certainly had to come up on Trump and Putin's phone call. My guess is that Putin kind of said, don't cross this line because we will really push the treaty. I don't know what the ramifications of breaking the treaty are, or if anybody could do anything if the U.S. broke the treaty anyways. Now, if you ever make this point to somebody, especially somebody on the right, you're probably going to get some pushback saying, no, these missile systems are there to defend against Iran because Iran wants to nuke Israel. And this is obviously ridiculous. I mean, the U.S. has bases in Turkey and Iraq and Afghanistan and all over the Middle East and a base in Djibouti. And so there's many other places that the U.S. could install these missile defense systems that would be much more strategic if the U.S. was concerned about a strike from Iraq. Even if you look, you could certainly install them further west than Poland and Romania. They're really there right next to Russia. And it seems pretty obvious, I think, to everyone that the only reason they would be so close to Russia is that they're there to deter Russia, but then the U.S. government lies about it, and then the media lies about it, and then people believe it, and it's just really unfortunate. But so that's a narrative you will have to talk about if you are trying to talk to somebody about the U.S. not putting these missile defense systems. I mean, the other problem is that they're just expensive and they don't work, and I think I talked about this before on a previous episode, just the false confidence that it gives politicians. I use the example, if a football coach mistakenly believes he has a really strong defense when really he has one of the worst defenses in the league, then that might lead him to being a more risky coach on the offensive end of the line, thinking that, oh, my defense could stop him, because we're so good there. And so I certainly think that it would lead U.S. citizens and the U.S. government to acting more recklessly if we believe that we're safe from anything bad happening to us. But if we do know the truth and that the missile defense systems don't work, and if we do bolster enough, and if we do saber rattle enough, and if we do start enough wars and put enough pressure on Russia, we could end up in the middle of a nuclear warfare where we lose U.S. cities. And so it's just such a huge mistake for anybody in the U.S. to believe that these missile defense systems work. And so it's just a waste of money, and it's causing problems with Russia unnecessarily if the U.S. installs these systems. So lots of reasons to oppose it and avoid it. Moving on to some Middle East stories, we have 3 U.S. soldiers being wounded in Afghanistan. This is a separate incident from the time that we had 2 U.S. fighters die fighting ISIS in Afghanistan. I never got the whole story there, if that was a friendly fire situation or if ISIS got them or if it was a mix of the two. However, I could very much guarantee that if those soldiers weren't over there, if Donald Trump wasn't such a coward and brought the troops home, and if Obama and Bush didn't put them there in the first place, those people would be alive. So, that's a simple truth, and it's important that if people ever realize that. The attack these soldiers were wounded in was an attack in the Afghan capital, Kabul. I think one of the significant parts of this whole story, not only that 3 U.S. soldiers were wounded, but where it happened. This is kind of America's real safe zone in Afghanistan, while there are other areas of Afghanistan that the Afghani government heavily controls. This is the one that has had the most U.S. presence, and for the terrorists to be attacking there is quite shocking. I think for some time there has been at least some talk in the anti-war movement about the possibility of the U.S. losing the war in Afghanistan, like U.S. soldiers outright having to flee for their lives from the Taliban coming in so heavily in Afghanistan. While I don't think we're there yet, and we're nowhere near that, because like I said, the government still controls 50% of the country, I think this is a sign to just show the cracks and how weak U.S. defenses really are in Afghanistan, and the fact that eventually the country's going to be overrun and once again be in the hands of jihadists. The attack was carried out by ISIS, not the Taliban. I did hear Scott Horn talking about and saying that there's really not that big of a difference between ISIS and Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. I think a lot of it is probably marketing. It's better to have an ISIS name right now if you're a jihadist and you're looking for some, rich Islamists to fund you, somebody who only has a limited amount of money to give, and so he's going to give to you or some other guy. At this time, having the name of ISIS is obviously, I guess, a better name for the terrorists, and so a lot of them are adopting it for that reason, especially in countries like Somalia and Yemen. We see this as well. But I think it is another just sign that ISIS is really a growing strength in Afghanistan as well. And I don't know if ISIS and the Taliban would ever merge if they both gain significant control of the country, or if, like we see in Syria, where they end up fighting each other. I think that's less likely than in Syria, though. So ISIS is growing in strength in Afghanistan as well as around the Middle East, and we keep dropping more bombs there. It's just amazing that nobody sees this correlation continuing. The more bombs you drop, the more terrorists you get. The more bombs you drop, the more terrorists you get. The more bombs you drop, it goes on and on and on, and no politician seems to have the ability to recognize this. There is a big looming question out there, and that is, will we see a second surge in Afghanistan? Trump, the Pentagon has already announced they're sending 1,500 troops this summer. This will be, I guess, at least what is the bare minimum needed to repel the Taliban, at least for the time being, and hold the stalemate. I have seen reports saying that the Pentagon is going to send at least 3,000 troops to Afghanistan. They're thinking of as many as 5,000. This certainly would be short of Obama's surge that I believe was 30,000 troops. However, this would bring U.S. totals in Afghanistan back up to the range of 15,000 U.S. troops there. I'm including special forces, which don't get included in most counts with that. And then also we have all the contractors there. And who knows, I mean, with the contractors, we may be at 30,000, fighters on the American payroll in that country. Well, I guess there's a lot more fighters on the American payroll in that country because of course, the Afghani military is pretty much all funded by the United States as well. So we're paying for everybody but the Taliban ISIS military budget in Afghanistan. Obviously, the fear here is that we're going to see more deaths. I mean, look at what happened in Kabul with the attack and 3 U.S. soldiers getting wounded and what was like a caravan of U.S. troops going by. ISIS came up, suicide bomb, killed 8 people, broke down a couple of U.S. vehicles. The men inside, I don't know how badly they're wounded, but luckily this time they didn't pass away. But next time, I mean, really, who knows? And if you're putting more troops in Afghanistan, it's just more targets for the terrorists. And unfortunately, as many terrorists as we kill, it obviously doesn't seem to matter because the Taliban are stronger now than they have been since 2001. And it just shows that the policy does not work. I think this would be probably one of the first and big mistakes that we're going to see in the Trump presidency if he goes ahead and puts these troops in Afghanistan. It's just going to kind of, I think, create the door that the neoconservatives are just going to flood through, like what happened to Obama. He caved on Afghanistan and then caved on everything else. So I think whenever you give an inch and they take a mile, and if Trump gives an inch and allows 5,000 additional troops in Afghanistan, I think they're just going to break the floodgates and we'll be at war everywhere like Obama was. Remember, Barack Obama bombed at least 7 different countries, and Trump, I think he's at 6 now, because I've heard that there have been U.S. drone strikes in Somalia under Trump, and so that would make it 6, with Libya being the one that Obama got that Trump hasn't. Moving to Mosul, we have the Pentagon releasing a report saying that the U.S. was responsible for 14 deaths on an attack in March 7th in Mosul that killed over 200 people, under 300, somewhere in between 200 and 300 people died. This was the attack that, after it occurred, the offensive in Mosul has really slowed down. So it would be interesting to know if any of it is, more pushback from the civilians, say, hey, you bomb us and you're just as bad as, ISIS to us. So we're not really going to help you out anymore. Or if that was, really just a huge humanitarian incident to kill a home filled of 250 or so people is absolutely a horrendous thing to do. And when history looks back at this story and sees what actually happened, is not going to shine America in a very pretty light. We have stories from witnesses on the ground, people who are around the area, survivors of the attack itself, saying that ISIS didn't push them into the building that the U.S. bombed. ISIS had a heavy presence in the neighborhood, and so the U.S. was bombing all the houses in the neighborhood, and the houses that they bombed on that day, the 3 remaining houses, everybody was there because nobody else had anywhere to go because they already bombed everything. So America forced them into into that position where they were all crammed in those houses and then dropped bombs on those houses. And that's the story. That's what happened, everyone. And it doesn't cast America in a pretty light at all. It doesn't say very great things about what America is doing overseas. It is certainly going to be a story that the terrorists try to use to recruit new fighters for them. And this is just the consequences of our foreign policy. And while the news could talk about however they want and report whatever false story about ISIS hurting the civilians into the building, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, a U.S. bomb killed between 200 and 300 Iraqi citizens who were all, essentially, displaced people at that time. Their houses had all been bombed. They had been forced out of their homes by ISIS, maybe. Any way they got there, they were killed by a U.S. bomb, and it's really sad. It's terrible. And as long as you continue the foreign policy that the U.S. is continuing, this is going to be the result, that we're going to bomb people. We're going to bomb a bunch of civilians in a house every now and then because we bombed all the other houses and they're all crammed into one. And sometimes the military gets wrong, no matter how much you like the military and how much you think that the U.S. military is a force for good. If you drop enough bombs on people, you're going to kill a lot of innocent people. There's no way around that fact. And unless you realize that, then you're going to continue to bomb innocent people and just not believe it, and you'll end up with more terrorism. While on the subject, I have a report saying that 1,438 civilians at least died in Iraq in April. That seems to be a pretty high number. And this is just the results of the absolutely reckless U.S. foreign policy. Obviously, the U.S. isn't responsible for all these deaths. I'm sure a lot of people died because of the Shia militias, because of ISIS, because of Al-Qaeda, because of Kurdish fighters, because of whoever else, and for whatever reason. The United States bears a responsibility for a lot, if not all of these deaths. I mean, think about how many of them were conducted at the hands of U.S. weapons. Even if ISIS shot them, they may have been using U.S. weapons, because ISIS has a ton of U.S. weapons. If the Kurds killed them, U.S. weapons. If the Shia militias killed them, U.S. weapons. If the Iraqi government killed them, U.S. weapons. In all these cases, it was the U.S. that put the gun in these people's hands. And while you're not responsible and you're not, morally liable for the actions of others all the time, certainly when you're giving weapons to bad people, if you go and give a gun to a serial killer and then he kills a bunch of people, well, you bear some responsibility for giving them the gun. We're also seeing a record number of deaths in Afghanistan. In 2016, 11,418 people, civilians, were killed in fighting in Afghanistan. These numbers likely don't include people who were killed, who were combatants, so this is only civilians. It doesn't include combatants. It doesn't include military. It doesn't include people who either starved to death or were unable to access a medical center because that medical center was destroyed. And it just goes to show the absolute carnage that's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq both. You're just seeing huge numbers of deaths over and over again. And like I said, for Afghanistan, this was a record for as long as the UN has been keeping the record, which is 2009. Moving to Syria, we have ISIS attacking SDF forces. Those are Syrian Democratic Forces, with I believe about 5 ISIS attackers with weapons and then detonated suicide vests. It looks like what happened is that ISIS attacked the Kurdish position, either drove back or killed off the Kurdish defenders, and then attacked civilians who fled from ISIS and were now camping with the Kurds. I should clarify that the SDF Syrian Democratic Forces aren't all Kurdish fighters. There are a lot of Arab fighters mixed in with the SDF, but the backbone of the SDF is the YPG, which is mostly Kurdish fighters. And of course, the SDF is the Syrian Democratic Forces that the U.S. is backing and is the main force that the U.S. is going to use to retake Raqqa from ISIS. One important part of this story is that we do have a lot of U.S. troops on the ground in Syria and an ever-increasing number of U.S. troops on the ground in Syria. And so if ISIS starts carrying out these attacks and we have U.S. troops embedded with the SDF fighters, then eventually we're probably going to see some American troops die. So if you don't want to see fellow Americans being killed in Syria over some city you can't find on a map, then call your congressman and tell him no more troops in Syria. Moving on to Yemen, we have the Yemeni Al-Qaeda, so Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, abbreviated AQAP, the leader of AQAP saying that the U.S. is fighting on the side of Al-Qaeda in Yemen. obviously the leader of Al Qaeda is probably trying to cause Trump some problems, and in all honesty, the U.S.'s goal in Yemen is probably not to help Al Qaeda. I don't think that Trump, lays in bed at night thinking about how he could help Al Qaeda beat the Houthis in Yemen. However, the very realistic picture of what's happening in Yemen is that the U.S. is supporting Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is supporting Sunni tribesmen who are fighting alongside Al Qaeda to either fight back the Houthis or to simply, keep their village from being taken by the Houthis. This story was somewhat brought to light whenever the botched U.S. raid occurred, and then some civilians spoke after the raid, just kind of saying what the situation was in their village, and that, Al Qaeda came into and through their village, because if Al Qaeda was there, then they had Al Qaeda protection from the Houthis, who, well, are certainly, not. I don't know if they're as bad as Al Qaeda, and they're certainly not as big of enemies as the U.S. people as Al Qaeda, but it seems odd that the U.S. is fighting on the side of Al Qaeda in this war. Part of all the places that the U.S. bombs are falling, and it looks like we're moving back to the early Obama days, where a gathering of a few military-aged males is enough to get a strike to happen, and then the U.S. just labels them as probable Al Qaeda members and dismisses them and their lives completely. Typically, the numbers are in the single digits, so they don't attract a lot of headlines. 4 people traveling in a car were hit by a Yemeni drone strike. Sometimes they get a couple civilians on the side of the road. Sometimes they get a house with a couple people in it. The U.S. isn't big on attacking weddings, I don't think, anymore, just because it draws too many negative headlines. But they pick them off 2, 4, 6, 8 at a time, and it's just a situation where if you think about what it would be like to live in Yemen and be a young male, and we think about how terrible it is for like a young black man on the streets of America today, where simply disobeying a cop will get you shot. Well, in Yemen, if you're a young Arab male and you're out in the tribal areas of Yemen, and you're 6 guys all getting together to hang out, you're a target by the U.S. government, and when you're dead, they'll label you a terrorist, and that'll be your mark on history. And so, man, it's rough. It's really rough. And if the Democrats would have as much outrage as things like this occurring as they do when young black people are shot in cities, then maybe we get somewhere on this issue. We have a story that I know I've touched on a little bit in the past, but I just want to bring it up again, and that is that there's 14 million people in Yemen who do not have access to any healthcare whatsoever. Cholera is going around in the country, and people in Yemen are dying from cholera right now, basically dehydrating themselves from having diarrhea. It's just a terrible thing going on, and if the U.S. backed off, then maybe they could have some more humanitarian aid going through. Certainly if Saudi Arabia backed off, they could have some more humanitarian aid going through. If Doctors Without Borders hospitals would stop being bombed by both sides of the war, by especially Saudi Arabia, then maybe some people could actually live and survive minor illnesses in Yemen. But it's just such a mess there, and it does look like Saudi Arabia is going to move forward and try to take the port of Hidayah from the Houthis in Yemen. And like I've been saying over and over on this show, this is likely going to cause a famine and just an absolute humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. So everybody be mindful of this and keep your eye on it. I do have a couple news stories out of India and Pakistan. This is, of course, always a big deal just because these are 2 nuclear superpowers, and even with the U.S. actions towards North Korea right now, I think India and Pakistan is likely more powder keg to go off than the North Korean incident. We had a situation where 2 Indian soldiers' bodies were mutilated. I don't have a lot of details on this story, so it could be false. It could be that they weren't actually Pakistani military people who desecrated the bodies. Maybe they were terrorists running around Pakistan, because there's certainly a lot of those. And then India carried out retaliation strikes, killing 7 members of the Pakistani military. So once again, this is just a step towards escalation in a situation where there's already a lot of tension and a lot of possibilities for war and even nuclear war to break out. I'd like to finish up today's podcast with a quick story about a 75-year-old U.S. disabled veteran that has been sentenced to life in prison for growing his own medical marijuana. I believe he was in Alabama or Mississippi, one of those states that doesn't have medical marijuana legalized. Well, not strictly a foreign policy story. It just goes to show how the U.S. how the U.S. treats the troops. I mean, in Syria, they turn them into border patrol, peace officers, essentially human shields in between the Kurds and the Turks. In Afghanistan, they, force U.S. soldiers to, go through the streets and then get attacked by suicide bombers. You have U.S. soldiers, of course, getting killed by suicide bombers in Mosul, Afghanistan. I don't know if there's been any in Syria under Trump, but Yemen is just, we don't treat our troops well. And this, veteran who may or may not have been suffering from a situation where he was disabled from his time that he served his country, but is somebody who the U.S. once granted moral authority to kill people. They said there's people over there who are bad people and mean America harm, and we give you the authority to go kill them without repercussions. And now that man can't even decide at 75 years old if he needs to smoke marijuana to have a decent quality of life. And the complete disparity there is one of the most amazing things to me. Just first, that the U.S. government asserts that it could give people the moral authority to kill other people, and that the second one, that those same people also don't have a right to decide what plants to put in their body. So those are my thoughts on the news from today. I hope everybody is enjoying the show, is staying up to date on the foreign policy news. It is important, and if we could ever get enough people to care about, maybe we can make some change and end some of these wars. If you like the show, I can't encourage you enough to share the show. It will make a big difference. I notice the shows that get more shares because the downloads are a lot higher. So if everybody could take a minute or two to share this show, it would help me out a lot. I really appreciate it. If you like the show a lot and you want to be more involved with it, check out my Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. We discuss a lot of current events, news stories in there, post some stuff. I like it. There's not many foreign policy groups out there on Facebook that have a lot of content sharing, and so if you want one, at least there's some going on in mine. You can follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE. My Facebook page is Kyle's Files, files spelled F-Y-L-E-S. My website is kylesfilesblog.com, files spelled F-Y-L-E-S. The page for the show is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And if you really like it, subscribe on iTunes and give me a rating and review. Thanks, everyone.